Welcome to the Washington Week Extra. I'm Yamiche Alcindor. If the tragic events that unfolded at Robb Elementary School had not happened, Wednesday's headlines would have been dominated by Georgia's midterm primary results. It's too early to tell whether the shooting pushes gun control up the list of issues voters care most about. But the midterms still offered a glimpse into voters' thinking. Governor Brian Kemp won his Republican primary race by more than 50 percentage points against Trump-backed candidate David Perdue. Kemp will face Democrat Stacey Abrams in the general election. It's a rematch of their 2018 governor's race. And Republican Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger defeated Jody Hice, who also was backed by former President Trump. The results are considered rebukes of former President Trump because he targeted Kemp and Raffensperger for refusing to support his efforts to overturn the 2020 election results. Quite something there. Joining me tonight to discuss this and more, Jake Sherman, founder of the political newsletter Punchbowl News. And joining me here in studio, Zolan Kanu-Youngs, White House correspondent for the New York Times, and Ashley Parker, White House bureau chief for the Washington Post. Thank you all for being here. It is kind of surreal that the midterms is the extra, but we had so much tragedy and stuff to talk about on the show. So I want to go to you, Ashley, of course. What's the biggest takeaway from the Georgia primary results, given the fact that that Republicans in particular really did try to, at least when it came to Brian Kemp, try to really protect his seat?
Well, it was definitely a bad night for Donald Trump, as you said, viewed probably correctly as a rebuke of him, although it's always worth noting that there is a difference when Trump is endorsing someone and supporting them than when Trump himself, with that sort of Trump X factor, is on the ballot. But it did show, I mean, these were revenge endorsements. Trump was basically trying to push out of power people who did not accept his false statement that the 2020 election was somehow rigged or stolen. And it showed that that alone is simply not enough, at least in Georgia, to get people over the finish line. A lot of David Perdue's campaign was simply that Trump had backed him and that, he did not believe the results of the 2020 election. And of course, again, politics is local, candidates matter. And Kemp was someone who, but for the fact that he accepted the results of a free and fair election, is actually incredibly conservative, right? He is known in that state and he fits that state quite well. And it's funny to think of him as a rhino, Republican in name only, because, just several years ago, he was often held up as an example of a radical far-right conservative. And so it turns out Donald Trump cannot make someone be something that they are not.
I mean, it is incredible that you're saying that just accepting the results of a free and fair election is somehow outlandish to former President Trump, but we covered him both, so we know that exactly where the thinking goes there. Revenge endorsements is also going to be one of my favorite words this midterm cycle. Jake, according to the Washington Post, I should say, the Republican Governors Association poured millions of dollars into Brian Kemp's race. I wonder what Republicans are saying on Capitol Hill about whether or not this could be a model for others who end up on the former President Trump's revenge list, given the fact that I will caveat that with the fact that all of these candidates somehow still want to get as close as possible to Donald Trump, even if they don't get an endorsement.
I think the broad consensus on Capitol Hill is that Trump makes some misguided endorsements. I think that's something that is plainly obvious to a lot of people on Capitol Hill. And I think a lot of people on Capitol Hill that I speak to have dug into crosstabs in Georgia and see that Trump is not, at least there, dispositive, as Ashley said. You can't make somebody that they're not. And we'll have to see how this plays out across the country. The dirty secret is Trump's endorsement record is padded by endorsing people who have no races. He does this constantly. And in the rest of the races, when he is endorsing in primaries or mostly in primaries that are contested, he does fairly well. But I would just say that across the country, we're going to see this year, Trump is going to bat 500. He's going to win half. He's going to lose half. And that's a pretty good average because in most states, he is a pretty powerful figure, a pretty popular figure. But Ashley put it well. I can't top her here. You can't make somebody they're not. You can't make out somebody to be someone that they're not.
It is true that a lot of us cannot top Ashley Parker, the Pulitzer Prize winner. So thank you for that. Zolan, I want to come to you because your colleagues at the New York Times, they looked into how former President Trump's, how his election lies have gripped state legislatures. And I want to read some of the statistics that they found. They found that 81% of Republican state legislators in Arizona took steps to discredit or overturn the 2020 election. That was the same. It's 78%. In Pennsylvania, 73%, in Wisconsin, 48% in Michigan. They also found that 357 sitting Republican legislators, these are, of course, elected officials in closely contested battleground states, took concrete steps to discredit or overturn the election results. That's 44% of Republican lawmakers. Given what we just heard there and the reporting here, you talk to national security experts all the time. What's that say about the state of our democracy?
Well, right. I was going to say my takeaway from all of this, even if we've got mixed results on Trump-backed candidates thus far, the big lie that he has promoted has absolutely been embraced throughout the country, even to mixed results in elections. You saw it resonate in Pennsylvania as well. You're seeing it throughout local communities. And this is the trickle effect from 2020, right? Or the ripple effect, if you will. Even if that presidential election is somewhat, it's behind us now, you are still seeing this denial of the results at this point. And it does have an impact, both not just politically, but also security-wise. We still have, when you look at FBI intel reports, DHS intel reports, they are still saying in those that false claims about the election continue to fuel potential political attacks. That's still a warning that's going out. So it's not only having an impact electorally, but you're seeing it having an impact, and our own national security officials and our own government warn that this is having an impact both on also on the safety.
And this is something that deeply worries democracy experts and people who study authoritarianism, because they can create a scenario, they liken it most to Viktor Orban in Hungary right now, where through very legal means, a set of systems are put in place that would make it, in fact, much easier to steal a future election, right? A state chooses electors, or in the case of Pennsylvania, elects a governor who is willing to overturn free and fair results. Those state legislatures, depending on the state, have a lot of power with which electors they choose. What Mike Pence was, former President Trump wanted Mike Pence to do, it didn't happen first and foremost because Pence refused, but also because the system held, right? But the system held because there were people in the system who believed in the system, right? Suddenly a Supreme Court is not, becomes politicized, and that changes things. And suddenly you have electors who are willing to overturn the results for their preferred candidate, and that changes things, and that can all be done from the inside legally, and that is the concern.
And Jake, jump in here. What's it tell you about the dangers of our election systems and the very place that you're covering all the time, which is Congress, and the sort of duty that lawmakers have?
Well, think of it this way, Amish. If what we know usually happens is going to happen again, which is Republicans are likely, if not almost certain, to take the House of Representatives, and Kevin McCarthy is the Speaker in 2024, he's going to be, at least in part, presiding over that joint session to certify election results. And he has become very close with the right wing of his party, many of whom, including him, have at least suggested that the election was not on the level. And he's tied himself to people like Jim Jordan and other folks on the hard right who have made that suggestion. So what does that look like? There have been efforts at this point, not successful efforts, to reform the system by which Congress certifies the election. That those efforts have been led by people like Joe Manchin and Susan Collins and other folks of kind of the middle of both parties. But those have not gone anywhere. So that's, if you are looking for something to be worried about, and I think this is a legitimate concern, that is something to be worried about, that the people in power in 2024 might not follow the traditional procedures.
Might not follow the traditional procedures could mean the end of American democracy. So that is very scary. I want to turn and stick with you, Jake, for another question, which is, obviously we're still focused on the tragedy and the details that are still coming out when it comes to Uvalde, Texas. But I have to also ask you, what's your sense of whether or not this changes the midterm election, changes the conversation that voters and lawmakers are having?
I could tell you that Democrats at this point, seem to be hopeful, obviously, that there's a gun reform package. But if not, they feel as if they're going to be able to run on two specific things that are traditionally Republican campaign messages: abortion and guns, meaning that Roe v. Wade is likely to be overturned. And if you put Republicans in power, they could overturn abortions they could make abortions illegal across the country. Number two, the gun situation is out of control. This is what Democrats would say. And we need to keep Democrats in office because we're going to try to crack down on guns. So those two, it's very difficult to say, Amish, at this point, sitting here today on May 27th, what's going to be dispositive in an election that's 6 months away. Democrats are hopeful that these two issues are galvanizing, but the reality is the districts that are competitive across the country are just marginally competitive. I mean, we live in a society in which people go home and play to their bases, and that makes none of these issues specifically powerful in an election.
Yeah, there's a flip side to that coin, too, in terms of Democrats rallying around this issue and galvanizing their base. Already, even before this shooting, before Buffalo, for months now, you have seen Republican candidates also putting out ads, digital ads, focusing on framing around gun rights as well. So whereas Democrats could now in recent weeks use this to galvanize the base to push for gun reform and say, look, if we lose majority, our chances of actually passing anything are very slim. You're also going to see Republicans continue to galvanize about that issue. They already are. My colleagues went and tracked all of the ads that Republicans have already put out, and guns are a central focus already for Republicans.
Last word to you, Ashley.
And for what it's worth, this is the counter is Senator Chris Murphy's theory of the case. Obviously, guns are a personal passion project after Sandy Hook, is that he wants to argue, and it's a debate within the Democratic Party, that Democrats should run on guns in the exact same way that Republicans do, and that Democrats have overlearned incorrect lessons from previous eras. There was a sense that after voting for the assault weapons ban in 1994, Democrats lost seats. But his argument is in 2018, we won by running on guns. That was in the wake of Parkland, and that this is actually a winning issue for us. So far, we have not seen that as fulsomely as guns being a winning issue for Republicans, but that is where he is trying to bring the Democratic Party.
Certainly a lot to keep in touch with, a lot to focus on. We'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much to Jake, to Zolan, to Ashley for joining us and for sharing your reporting. I'm Yamiche Alcindor. Good night from Washington.